Hi class, it's Dr. Geis again. We are going through some of these modules that are in the Preparing and Applying for Graduate School in Psychology by Dr. Norcross and Dr. Hogan. Again, I'm utilizing their slides, so but I thought I would highlight some good stuff that are in there. So the second of those modules is reviewing your career options in psychology, which I think is a really important one for us to. Let's go ahead and get into this. As you probably took in your intro class, you probably knew that there is different types of psychology, right? So clinical, counseling, school, development, education, social and personality, IO, research, biological, and other types of subfields. And as you can see, the majority of the subfield is in clinical, and if you combine like that with counseling, for example, those are some of the bigger subfields that we have. And clinical and counseling and even school psychology are the ones where we actually do practice. So we will do therapy with individuals, and they have a slightly different emphasis. Since most people that are interested in graduate programs are going to go into clinical psychology, let's focus on the training models that are there in clinical psych. So there's the PhD route, which is called the Boulder model, and then there's the PsyD route, which is called the Vail model. There are very important differences, so you need to know before you're interested in applying to either of these programs. So the Boulder model, this comes from a conference that actually occurred in Boulder, Colorado. So they wanted to have more equal weight in developing your research and your clinical skills. They call this the scientist practitioner model. So this was what I got trained under. So I got a PhD. This was the required degree. And I learned how to be a scientist first and foremost and use that scientific knowledge in order to practice. So I learned a lot about like what are our best practices in psychology, and then how do I actually apply that to my cases. This also included like, knowing how to track my students or not my students, how to track my clients and how my clients were doing over time. So, doing assessments, I was trained in a pretty rigorous manner of how to do assessments by the DSM-5, for example. And I learned a lot about, how do I track progress on how their symptoms are going. The Vail model came a little bit later from a conference in Vail. And they wanted to bring this apart and say that PhDs are really about the scientist and the PsyDs are really about the practitioner. They have a lot more, so the PsyDs have a lot more of these training sites, and they are freestanding psych schools. So they really are kind of distinguishing themselves from being a PhD itself. So you will get more emphasis on the practitioner if you go through this Vail model of actually doing therapy. How do you actually do it? So in this next slide, really there's a lot of professional schools out there. Not all of them are PsyDs, but a lot of them are. And a lot of the degrees that we're now getting are actually in PsyDs. So again, just realize that they really are working more towards that profession of being a therapist at the end. So there are a lot of differences here. So this is the difference between basically the PhD and the PsyD. So the PhD individuals are more likely to produce research versus the PsyD just consuming that research. So if you're interested in any type of kind of research background, something to do with, hey, I want to research whether or not this therapy works, you're going to want to probably pursue a PhD compared to a PsyD. I still don't think this length of training is any different. So I have to look that up and see if PhDs really are that much longer than PsyDs. PhDs are more competitive. Acceptance is down to about 8%, whereas PsyDs is 40 to 50%. And financially, PsyDs are more expensive. Typically, the PsyD model is coming kind of more from like a med school model. So you're paying through your school, and if you only have about 1% who receive full financial assistance, that's not very many. Whereas PhDs, 85% of PhD students will receive full tuition remission and financial assistance. So that might be something to weigh out also, is what your financial situation is. So the PsyD debt is around $180,000. You also might want to look at, well, how much does the PsyD make at the end of their program, and can you make up that difference? We'll talk about this in a bit also, but internships are whether or not we can get into the last year of a clinical psych program is a full year internship where you are working as a therapist only. And PsyDs tend to match at a lower rate. So it's this match program where, you go out and you say, yes, I want to work for, University of Michigan, and I want to work for, UCSD. That's not exactly true. The VA. I want to work for the VA, for example. And PsyDs tend to have a lower match. And at the end, you have to complete a licensure exam. And PsyD students attending large programs score lower on average. The licensure right now, I think for most states, is really whether or not you pass, so pass or fail. So you just have to make some bare minimum. So yes, if they even score lower on average, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not passing. So these are different types of models, and you should know that before you start, applying to these different programs. I just think this is a really interesting graph where we look at the acceptance rate, right? So freestanding PsyDs are over here on the left, research-oriented PhDs are over here on the right, and you can see that as you get closer to that research-oriented PhD, you're less likely to get in because the acceptance is pretty low. But at the same time, research-oriented PhD is more likely to get full support, whereas freestanding PsyD programs are not. Here's another thing, some key terms to look at when you're looking at schools is what they actually use as their title. So PsyD oftentimes will talk about being practitioners. Somewhere where you have more of that equal emphasis of both the practice and the research, they'll just talk about it as being scientist practitioners. Clinical scientist is the new terminology that we're coming down to. So like when I was there at the University of Michigan, we actually moved towards a clinical science model where research was heavily emphasized, and that was really what you were looking for. So these are some of the key terms that you might want to look at in the mission statements to see where they fall in that continuum. So I'm going to stop this video here before it gets too long, and we'll talk a little bit about accreditation and licensure next.